Hello and welcome to the March meeting of Citizens Climate Lobby Boston and Boston Metro West chapters. And I'll hand it over to our state coordinator, Gary, to introduce our speaker for today.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the meeting. Tonight, we're very excited to have Nathaniel Stinnett with us. Nathaniel is the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that uses data analytics and behavioral science to mobilize environmentalists to vote. Named one of the 5 global climate visionaries by the New York Times in 2018 and dubbed the voting guru by Grist magazine, Stinnett is a frequent expert speaker on cutting-edge campaign techniques and the behavioral science behind getting people to vote. Tonight, Nathaniel will fill us in on EVP's cutting-edge work using behavioral science to turn non-voting environmentalists into consistent voters. He'll describe the latest data and messaging techniques the campaigns use to mobilize voters and provide insight into the environmental movement's political opportunities in 2022. So with that, Nathaniel, welcome to Boston CCL.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gary. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, everybody else. There are some of you whom I know. There's some of you whom I trade emails with or go back and forth with on Twitter in nice ways and things like that. But it's just like, it's so cool to see all your faces. And obviously I live in Boston and love Boston and I love CCL. So I don't know, I almost feel like this is a homecoming of sorts or something, but it is very cool to be with you. We've got 20 minutes, that's it. So I am gonna fly through this stuff. So please bear with me if I don't go into really any detail on a lot of the stuff that I'm discussing, but hopefully we will have some time for Q&A at the end. But I am mindful of all of your time and that the clock is ticking. So we're gonna try to do this quickly. Oh, I cannot share my screen. So Gary, could you make it so that I could share here?
Matt can fix that.
Oh, Matt, wonderful. Thank you, Matt.
Can you share now?
All right, here we go.
Okay, I see
and
that.
Perfect.
Great. Matt, are you seeing these slides go back and forth?
Yes, sir.
Great. All right. I'm going to very briefly discuss who the Environmental Voter Project is, what we do and why we do it, some of our results, and how you, if you're interested, might be able to make a difference with us. So, in a nutshell, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that just does 2 things. We find environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. That's it. That's it. What that also means is we don't do a lot of the stuff that your typical environmental nonprofit does do. So for instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. As odd as it might sound, we don't even try to convince people to care more about climate or the environment. A good way to think of us is we're not even in the opinion changing or the mind changing business. Instead, we are solely in the behavior changing business. We identify people who care so deeply about climate and the environment that it's their #1 priority. So they don't need their minds changed. They don't need to be educated on anything. But they don't vote. And so what they need is purely a behavioral intervention. And that's why we're this weird environmental nonprofit that talks about like data science and behavioral science all the time. Because really all we do is find these people and then change their behavior. Find the non-voting environmentalists and turn them into better voters. And the reason we focus on that is this, and this is just one poll out of a billion, but for better or for worse, usually for worse, every poll tends to look like this. This in particular is a poll that was taken a little while ago. It was right after the 2020 presidential election of actual voters, actual people who voted in the 2020 general. They were asked what their top 3 issue priorities were. Only 14% listed climate or the environment as one of their top 3 priorities. Now, the good news is that that number didn't used to be at 14. It used to be lower than that. But the bad news is that's nowhere near where we need it to be. nowhere near where we need it to be. Because take it from an old political hack here. Politicians can't just snap their fingers and get whatever they want. Whether they're the so-called right politicians or wrong politicians, they all need to decide what to spend their political capital on. And they can't spend it on everything. And so they pick and choose. And the stuff that's way, way down the list of voter priorities never gets chosen. Boy, is it hard for any politician, even the best, most courageous, most environmentally friendly of them, boy, is it hard for them to justify spending all their political capital on something that voters don't care about. Boy, is that hard. And it's particularly hard because of this. This is the one thing with only 20 minutes that I will get into the weeds on because it's so crucially important. Most people don't realize the most essential building block of politics in this country. And that is that whether you vote or not is public record. It's public record. Most people know that who you vote for is secret, and it is, but whether you vote or not, like what elections you cast a ballot in and what elections you don't cast a ballot in, that's public. And not only is it public, it is the essential building block to how all campaigns are run, and I might add, how all policy is made. And here's why. Very, very quickly, I'll bring you through an example here. Let's say, who was the gentleman I was so excited about lives in Roslindale? Oh, well, I've forgotten his name, but I'll use Gary as an example. Gary, congratulations, you're running for governor of Massachusetts. All right. Unfortunately, though, you hired me as your campaign manager. And so I'm going to walk you through what the Gary for Governor campaign looks like. It starts with the same scene that every single campaign over the last 30 years has started with. It's a bunch of people getting into a conference room, all around a table. They open up their laptops. They look at public voter files. Remember what I told you, whether you vote or not is public record. And we start figuring out, okay, who should we talk to? I mean, no matter how good Gary is at fundraising, he's going to have limited time and limited money. And his only goal is to get 50% plus one of the vote on a Tuesday in November. So we can't just talk to everybody. So we open up our public voter files and we say, oh, okay, these people over here, they aren't registered, forget them. Oh, these people are registered, but we can see they never vote, forget them. Oh, these people are registered. Oh, and they do vote, but only in presidential elections. Got to forget them too. Oh, these people vote in gubernatorials. Oh, and these people, they even vote in local elections. Okay, these last two groups, they're the ones we're going to talk to. Maybe if we're awash in cash, we'll spend our last dollars on some of these drop-off voters, some of the ones who just vote in presidentials. But mostly, you're only going to talk to the people who actually vote in the election you want to win. And I know that sounds cynical, but I mean, it's something we accept in every other aspect of our lives, right? Like Starbucks doesn't care about you if you don't drink coffee. They only care about coffee drinkers. Why would politicians care about you if you don't vote? Especially if they have a public record with names and street addresses of who votes and who doesn't vote. So this is the first step that any campaign goes through. And then who do you think they poll to figure out who cares about what issues? Well, not the non-voters. I'm sorry, I don't care how many of them care about climate. We are trying to win one election, and only voters, people who actually cast ballots, get to decide who's going to win that election. So yeah, politicians and policymakers look at these public voter files, and you better bet they only bother to measure the opinions and priorities of the actual voters. And that's why polls like this are such bad news for the environmental movement. Because when you zero in on those voters, far, far too few of them list climate or the environment as a top priority. But here's the interesting thing, and this gets to why we do the work that we do at the Environmental Voter Project. It turns out the reason so few voters care deeply about the environment isn't because too few Americans do. Actually, there are tons of Americans who care deeply about climate and the environment. Tens of millions of them. So why aren't they showing up in polls of voters like this? Well, for one pretty simple reason. Environmentalists aren't that good at voting. The modern American environmental movement doesn't have a persuasion problem as much as we have a turnout problem or a behavioral problem. And although it's frustrating to think like, oh my gosh, there are all these people who care about climate and the environment out there who aren't voting. It's actually an enormous opportunity. Because we live in a moment in time where it's almost impossible to change people's opinions about anything, let alone climate. It's almost impossible to change their minds. But changing their behavior? Well, I won't claim that's easy. Of course it isn't, but it's a lot easier. And it's a lot cheaper too. All right, so I'm going to quick run through exactly the size of this opportunity, how we take advantage of it, and some of the results that we're getting. When I say there are lots of environmentalists who aren't voting, this is what I mean. 8.1 million already registered. So it isn't they were unregistered, isn't that they were unregistered. They were already registered super environmentalists just decided not to walk out the door and cast a ballot in the 2020 presidential election. That's a huge number. As you can see, in midterm elections, the numbers are even higher. 8 months from now, when we have our midterm election, we think, based off these public voting histories, that these environmentalists we've identified, there are over 13 million of them who are already registered, who list climate or the environment as their top priority, and they've never voted in a midterm before. That's a huge, huge opportunity. So this is why the Environmental Voter Project has this narrow focus that we've got. It's not that all the other work is unimportant. God knows it's important. But it's also really important to find these people who are already with us, and they're not just taking this one crucially high leverage action. So how do we do it? It's a 3-step process. I'm going to fly through this because we have a really small amount of time here. First, identification. We work with data scientists to build predictive models on voter files. I'm sorry, I know I just made a few of your eyes cross there. But very, very quickly, what that means is we poll huge numbers of people. We poll tens of thousands of people, ask people what their #1 issue is, then isolate the ones who list climate or some other environmental priority, and then work with data scientists to figure out, okay, what do we know about these people? What publicly available data do we have about them? We only use publicly available data, but that doesn't mean that there isn't rich data out there. And once we get a good idea of who the 2,000 people are in Florida who just told us that climate's their #1 priority, we can start finding other people like them on the voter files. And iterate and reiterate and iterate and reiterate, kind of like an insurance company building a huge actuarial table so they can guess how long you're going to live and sell you an insurance policy. But we're doing the same thing. We're trying to guess how likely every single individual on the Florida state voter file is to not just care about climate or the environment, but list it as their #1 priority. And I know this sounds very convoluted, but it is frighteningly accurate. And this is how political campaigns target people now, at least the sophisticated ones, presidential campaigns, Senate campaigns. No one targets by demographic group anymore. People might say they're targeting soccer moms, but they're not. How they're targeting is they're saying, oh, Josephine Smith at 123 Main Street has a 79.2% likelihood of listing climate as her top priority. Let's go get her. And I know that sounds creepy. It is a little creepy. But I also know I don't need to explain to you the enormity of the climate crisis that we're facing. And as long as we're using publicly available data to find these people who are already with us and they're just not voting, you better believe we're going to do it. Second thing we do is when we find these people, we know they're already with us, or at least it's a probabilistic model. So they have a very high likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their top priority. And what that then allows us to do is bypass the hardest, most expensive part of politics, which is changing minds. and go right to behavior change. And because these people are already with us, we can be completely agnostic with our messaging. We could talk about chocolate chip cookies if it was the best way to get these people to vote. And so what we do is we run hundreds of randomized control trials, figuring out which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists, just to do one thing, and that's to turn them into better voters. We live in the behavioral psychology and behavioral economics of what it takes to change behavior over time. And oddly enough, we almost never end up talking about climate or the environment. Not because we don't like to, we love talking about that stuff, but it doesn't work that well when you're just trying to change a non-voter into a voter. Instead, we use like subtle forms of peer pressure, like, hey, did you know last time there was an election, 11 of your neighbors turned up to vote, or things like that. That's the stuff that works best. And then finally, habit reinforcement. Ultimately, what we care most about is not our impact in one-off elections. It's about changing the dynamic that I started with, changing the fact that so few voters list climate or the environment as a top priority, because that really hurts our ability to pass significant climate legislation. And so what we do is we work year-round, not just in the big sexy elections. We work in every election, even like library trustee and dog catcher races. Because even though those elections might not have anything to do with environmental policy making, you better believe that they're great behavioral interventions. And if what you really care about is turning non-voters into voters, you can't afford to skip an election. There are too few of them each year. And so whenever there's an election, we use it as an opportunity to deliver this behavioral science-informed messaging to our voter targets. All right, I know I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna rush to the finish here. Through the end of 2020, and we're about to be able to release data through the end of 2021, we had spoken with, either canvassed or called or texted or sent mail or digital ads, 7.4 million of these low propensity environmental voters. Now remember, if we're talking to you, by definition, you are not a good voter, or you are not a consistent voter at least. By the end of 2020, 730,000 of those 7.4 million had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal, state, and even local election. They had become super voters. This is what we're looking to make happen. Moreover, just this past year, now we only have data from the first half of last year, we submitted our work to randomized control trials, and I won't get into what that is because I know I'm running out of time and I'm just gonna rush to the end here. But what we know is that we can set aside low propensity environmental voters in a control group and then only message to the treatment group, and then after the election, see what the difference is in turnout, and thereby control for outside variables. And you can see, even in elections like that Georgia US Senate runoff that happened a year ago, where $1 billion were spent, we only spent 550,000, and we were solely responsible for boosting turnout almost 1 full percentage point among our 300,000 targets. If you don't think 1% is a big deal, ask Donald Trump. It is everything in this business. It is everything. All right, our volunteers love working with us. I'm not gonna read this stuff to you, but they are the core of our work. They help us postcard, they help us canvass, they help us call. We also send direct mail and digital ads. These are the 17 states that we're working in. I'm not going to tell you why we're working in them because we're running out of time, but these are the 17 states that we're working in. You'll see we have already identified huge numbers of low propensity environmental voters in these 17 states. Let's just take Arizona as an example. Huge battleground state in 8 months. We've identified almost 252,000 super environmentalists there who have never voted in a midterm. What does that number mean in Arizona? Well, that's so big that it's almost 11% of all ballots that were cast last time there was a midterm in Arizona. How can you get involved? We would love for you to go to environmentalvoter.org. You can sign up to volunteer. You can make phone calls, you can do postcards, you can knock on doors. You are always trained. We tell you what to say, we give you the materials, we give you the postage for the postcards. And it's all evidence-based messaging that we know works. We would love to have your support. And if you would like me to chat to another group that you're a part of, another CCL group, or a group of your friends, or things like that, please reach out and contact us. We always love expanding our network, and we particularly love the CCL community. All right, I apologize for going a few minutes over, but thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions. I fear not. I went a little bit over, but I'll let Matt and Gary decide that.
I think we can do 1 or 2 questions if anybody has one. Alan?
Yeah, I got one. Yes. So I'm curious as to what you know about people who are of conservative persuasion, who aren't voting, but are concerned about the political climate. I mean, I'm not political climate, about climate change, about the environment. Because it seems to me that this is a very core group, that if we can move them, not changing their position on social and economic issues, but if we can move those conservative people who are worried about the environment, then we can really begin to score some big change.
Yes, that's a great question. And there's some that we know and some stuff that we don't know. And I'm not trying to be cagey here. It's just that voter file data isn't always very good or precise when identifying people's ideology, sort of place on an ideological spectrum. Oftentimes you know what their party affiliation is, but as all of us in Massachusetts know, that's kind of weird too, right? Like in Massachusetts, Democrats are a minority. Most people don't know that. Unenrolled voters are a majority here in Massachusetts, but other states don't allow you to do that. And so even party affiliation stuff is kind of weird. But Alan, with that enormous caveat, let me say, this is what we do know about some of the sort of demographic trends among the more moderate and conservative people who care deeply about climate and the environment. First of all, oh my gosh, are they young? Oh my gosh. Now, people who tend to list climate or the environment as a top priority are young, period, regardless of where they are on the ideological spectrum. But when you look at the more conservative ones, I mean, they are almost, I don't want to say almost completely young, but really, really trend young. We also see an enormous gender gap. Again, that is something that we see across the entire ideological spectrum, which is that women are much more likely than men to list climate or the environment as a top priority. But when you isolate moderate and conservative people, that gender gap is even wider. The third thing I'll just say, and this is only relevant in a few states, because there are only a few states where you can get a really, really big racial data set and ideological data set, overlay them and still have big enough numbers that like it actually has statistical significance. But we are seeing in a few states that there are a decent number of, well, let's put it this way. There is a disproportionately high number of Hispanics among the population of moderate or conservative climate people. So much more than you would see in the overall electorate. So does that mean that they're a majority of that group? No, not at all. But Hispanics make up a disproportionately large part of moderate and conservative climate folks. They're a larger part of it than the underlying overall electorate. So those are three things that we do know about those people.
Anybody else? Any other questions?
I just have a quick question. I was listening to the national CCL national call on Saturday, and there was a woman from the Yale climate change communication project, and she was talking about persuasion through a trusted messenger. And I was wondering if you in terms of issue, obviously is more driven towards one issue, but in terms of party or in terms of location or anything else, do you use that method at all, or is it just here's some bullet points in a script and go for it?
Really, really great question. So surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly to many of you, but there's an enormous difference between persuasion messaging or sort of mind-changing messaging and turnout or behavior change messaging. The folks at Yale are absolutely right that when you're in the sort of mind-changing or persuasion world, messaging from a trusted messenger is enormously important. It is crucially important. It is much, much less important in the behavior change world. Much, much less. And so we do not do that. We have tried running some tests to see. We've run randomized control trials to see if it makes a difference. We have not seen a difference yet. So we don't do that. But there are some things that, for lack of a better word, Yannick, are kind of adjacent to that do work well in the setting of behavior change messaging. What do I mean by that? Well, there are a lot of societal norms that can be used to change people's behavior that are more powerful if someone in your peer group is talking to you about them. So, for instance, it's one thing if I call from Idaho and say, hey, last time there was an election, 422 people on your block of Main Street turned out to vote. It's another thing if I say, hey, I'm a volunteer with EVP and I also live in Waltham. And did you know last time there was an election, 427 people on your block of Main Street turned out to vote? That local affinity heightens the power of that peer pressure. It heightens the stickiness of that social norm that if your neighbors are doing something, you want to do it. And so there are some things that are kind of adjacent to what you brought up, Yannick, that we take advantage of. But the trusted messenger stuff is much more powerful for persuasion messaging than it is for behavior change messaging.
Great, thank you.
All right, Nathaniel, thank you very much for making time for us tonight. It's been great. And hopefully some of us will be going to evp.org and signing up to put in whatever we can between now and this year's elections.
Well, thank you. It's environmentalvoter.org. And we would love to have all your help. And if I could just close by thanking all of you again, just boy, am I just filled with so much admiration for the work that all of you do. And so I hope you feel good about it. And I hope you know that you have fans out there. So just well done. Well done.
We know now. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for
Bye-bye.
coming out.
Yep.
See you later.
Nathaniel.